Hello, everyone. This is what your pastor didn't tell you. Today, I am on with Dr. Reinhard Achenbach. We're going to be talking about the Sabbath in Genesis. What your pastor didn't tell you today. Genesis 1 and other texts. Reinhard Achenbach. All of a sudden, I hear an echo, so that's a little weird. Sabbath in Genesis. What your pastor didn't tell you today. Genesis 1 and other texts. Reinhard Achenbach. All of a sudden, Sabbath in Genesis. Can you hear me? Okay. One and other texts are all of a sudden this is really Can you hear me okay? All right. All right, so we'll start this again. I'll have this out later. But hello, everyone. This is what your pastor did tell you. Today I'm on with Dr. Reinhard Achenbach. We're going to be talking about the Sabbath in Genesis, as Genesis 1 as a text. The Sabbath in Genesis. What were you saying there, Dr. Reinhard? Genesis 1 as a text.
Hello.
The Sabbath.
Hear every sentence 5 times.
1 as a. That is so weird. That is very
weird. So there is
Sabbath.
Failed connection. 5 times.
Okay.
That is so weird. Voices.
All right. I'm going to leave and then I'm going to come back.
Failed connection. Okay.
Okay.
That is so weird. Voices.
All right. I'm going to leave and then I'm going to come back.
Okay. Okay. Voices.
All right. I'm going to leave and then I'm going to come back.
Yeah.
Okay. How am I now? Is there a bunch of echoes? All right. I'm going to leave.
Continues with the echoes.
How am I now? Is there a bunch? All right.
Continues with the echoes.
I've never had this happen here. So yeah, I'll have. Can you leave? Press the button at the bottom there, leave studio, and then come back. I'll have.
Okay.
Can you leave? Press the button at
I
the bottom
leave
there,
and
leave
come
studio.
back.
Yeah. Okay. That was super weird, guys. I've never had that happen. That was wild. And it was working perfectly fine as soon as we hopped on, and then all of a sudden I pressed live, and now there's this 17 of me. All right. All right. How are we now?
Now I hear you without disturbances.
Well, let's cross our fingers there.
Yeah.
That was crazy. So, all right, we'll try this again. 17th the charm. Hello, everyone. This is what your pastor didn't tell you today. I'm on with Dr. Reinhard Achenbach. We're going to be talking about the Sabbath in Genesis 1 and texts throughout the Hebrew Bible, specifically the Torah. Dr. Achenbach, he talks about in his papers the idea that the Sabbath theology of working in 6 days and then resting on the 7th, that idea seems to change. The reasoning for it changes as history goes on in history, as well as its effect on Genesis 1. So that changes the final text that we have today. So really interesting scholarship here. We're going to be really laying that out and discussing it in detail. How are you doing today?
Thank you. I'm fine. I'm looking forward to our talk with pleasure. And thank you for your interest in my research. And thank you to all who listen to us.
Awesome. All right. So this might get really complicated really quick. So we might have to explain the basic concepts and a little bit one by one, but just in general, a big summary, full picture. Could you just give us a summary of your paper that you wrote on the Sabbath in Genesis 1 and the Pentateuch?
Let me please start with a general remark on the attitude to read the Torah. Because I know that there are different approaches in understanding the Torah. You can read the Torah as a full revelation by God related to Moses, and then you read it as a unit and try to find out the teaching of this unit. At the same time, the Torah tells us a story. So when you read the Torah from the beginning, you find the commandment in Genesis 2:2-3, to rest on Sabbath, because the Lord, after creating the world, has rested. But then the issue vanishes from the narrative. So no Abraham, no Jacob, no Joseph is having a Sabbath, not even the Israelites in Egypt, but they are taught by the Lord in the desert to keep the Sabbath. And then we find that Moses receives the revelation at Mount Sinai, and there are two reasonings about the origin of Sabbath. And then he receives a collection of laws, which he calls the Sefer HaBerit, the Covenant Code. And there we have another distinction on the Sabbath, and we find several distinctions even then in the book of Leviticus, where you have a collection of laws that are called the Holiness Code in 17-26. And at the end of the Torah, you find another book, the Deuteronomy, where Moses repeats the laws, but Sabbath is only mentioned in chapter 5 in the decalogue, and here the reference to the creation is left out. Otherwise, the book of Deuteronomy does not refer to Sabbath. So this means that for a person who wants to have the revelation by the synchronic reading, there are different perspectives on the Sabbath in the run of the reading of the Torah, and they try to complement each other and read them as complementary interpretation of what to do on Sabbath. Then we have, of course, since the 18th century, the insight of an historical understanding that the texts of the Torah have been written down by scribes, and that they were collected from different sources, and that there was a process of formation of the Pentateuch, of the 5 books. In Jewish, it's Chumash, the 5-book Pentateuch. And there we can observe that there are hints to a development of the observation of Sabbath and understanding of the commandment in the period when the biblical scriptures were canonically written down. Now, what I do is, as a professional exegete of these texts, to connect to this historical exegesis and try to reconstruct the process of the formation and look which are texts that contain arguments for an older formula and which are texts that followed it, and what were the interests to combine them. So if you listen to me, you listen to a special way of reading the Torah in a diachronic way, not as a synchronic whole, but a diachronic formation of texts that were formed out in the ages between the 8th century and the 2nd century before Christ. I think that's a basic, so that even our listeners know where am I starting.
Mm-hmm.
Now, the analysis of the Pentateuch started in the 18th century, and people saw that there is a frame narrative that was identified as a priestly product that starts in Genesis 1 and can be followed until Exodus 40 or even Leviticus 9. And this narrative gave a framework to put in older traditions from other sources into this composition. In the 19th century, Julius Wellhausen has observed a second thing, that the laws, that means the laws you find in Exodus 20, verse 19 to 23, 33, consist of an older material, and in Exodus 24 they are called covenant code. They still have the idea that the Lord is worshipped on different places with many altars in the whole land. But in Deuteronomy, in chapter 12 to 26, we have a collection of laws that take up these older regulations and demand that the Lord should only be worshipped at one place, the one place he has chosen. And the research and Wellhausen brought this together with King Josiah, about whom we can read in 2 Kings 22 to 23, that he tried to make a reform and demanding what we read in Deuteronomy 6, 4 to 5. Shema Yisrael Adonai Eloheinu. Hearken, Israel, the Lord is our God, Adonai Echad, the only one. And you shall love him with all, serve him and love him with all your soul and all your heart and all your power. So this was the first commandment formulated, the Shema, as a program. But as we can read in Kings, this program was not long obeyed to. After Josiah was killed by the Egyptians, and we can read in the book of Jeremiah about the decline of Judah under the Babylonian assault. So the people, the elite, the kings, the scribes were deported in two stages. In the first stage, including Ezekiel, they were deported to Nippur, Tel Aviv, and then the other were deported to Babylonia, and some were refugees who went to Egypt, and some stayed in the country. This period we call the Babylonian exile. And Wellhausen saw that the centralization happened in the 7th century. The destruction of the temple happened at 587. But at the end of that period, Babylon was conquered by the Persians. And at that time, the priests who were in exile wrote a new story about the origins of Israel. And this story said, the Lord who created the world has revealed himself in a tired way first as God, Elohim, to all the world, then as God Almighty, El Shaddai, to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. You can read that in Genesis 17. And at the end, he revealed his holy name to Moses in Egypt, according to Exodus 6, 2-8. And Moses led the people out from by the help of God from Egypt and brought them to Mount Sinai, where God revealed himself and told him that he wanted to dwell in the middle of Israel. And Moses built a sanctuary, a tabernacle, and he built the ark. And God went down from Mount Sinai and took his dwelling in the middle of Israel. And Wellhausen saw that this, of course, was a story that had the idea from the beginning that there only was one chosen place where God shall be worshipped. And this is why he dated this priestly narrative later than Deuteronomy. And when the scribes and the Israelites came back from exile by help of the Persians, it took a while until they could build the second temple, and not all priestly groups came back at the same time. But those who believed that Deuteronomy was important, they came back. They called themselves Levitical priests. And then, of course, there was a group behind Deutero-Isaiah, the second part of the book of Isaiah, who learned that now the God of Israel was not only the God of the people, the tiny people rescued from Egypt, but that he was the God who had the whole world in his hand. He elected the Persian king Cyrus to reign the world, but it was he who was the only God. You can read that in Isaiah 45. And these formed a movement of, let me say, restoration. And of course, at that time, they took up the scriptures that the followers of Deuteronomy had written about the history of Israel, which we call Deuteronomistic. And these Deuteronomists said, at the mountain in the desert, God has not only elected us to be his holy people, but he has given us the commandments that you can read in the decalogue. And they noted the decalogue as a program and put it before the Deuteronomic law of Josiah. So the scribes in the Second Temple period, who had collected many, many scrolls, they had the priestly narrative and they had the Deuteronomistic narrative. And of course, they had old traditions about Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, about Moses. They had a lot of ancient traditions that had been written down before too. And they wanted to have a document about the origins of Israel and the origins of God's will for the Second Temple community. And this is the reason why they composed a new scroll collecting the priestly narrative together with the older texts and the Exodus story with the covenant code, because this was the older revelation. And then the narrative about the wandering through the desert to the land, and the speech of Moses in Deuteronomy as a renewal of the covenant, and as a condition, when we enter the land, we stand on the basic of this covenant. And then they reported on the conquest of the land by Joshua with the help of God. So this scroll that comprises texts from all books, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, Joshua, we call the six-book scroll, or the Pentateuch. And this was the oldest formation of the Pentateuch. But we can see that in addition to this scroll, at a later stage, there has been introduced the idea that the community that gathers close to the sanctuary should be more radical in its obedience against the law. They should not only call themselves the people of God, but they should call themselves the holy God has chosen us to be his holy people. And they developed a holy lifestyle. And the rules for that were put into that collection of the Pentateuch composition. This has always been seen, and recently Israeli scholar Israel Knoll has confirmed that this collection has come into the text later. Now, what my friend Eckhart Otto and I thought about was when did they do it? And we can see in the discussion that the biblical narrative about Nehemiah and Ezra has been turned around by Hellenistic scribes and must be corrected. Ezra was not before Nehemiah, but he came after Nehemiah, and that means that he performed his radical reform in 398 under Artaxerxes II. The reason was that Artaxerxes wanted the support of the Jerusalem and Judean holy community because he had lost Egypt, and so Judah was the border of his empire. So scribes that came from Nippur, perhaps, and they were close to the tradition of Ezekiel, and said, "We are the ancestors of Zadok, the priest at the time of Solomon." They came back, and I guess, together with Eckhart Otto and others, that it was the influence of this Sadducite priests to bring in the Holiness Code into the collection and to establish a new lifestyle of holiness. Now, what Knoll and others have observed is that this focus on the teaching of God about the law leaves out the question of the conquest story, and concentrates to fill up the Torah with a lot of priestly commandments, and of course to look that the basic priestly commandments should be followed. And now we are at the point that you can understand my paper, because they intensified the tradition of Sabbath. They intensified the tradition to follow the first commandment and the commandment to love your next. And they intensified the commandment of circumcision and of firstborn offerings and of a regular religious observance. And they intensified the demands of purity, not eating impure things. And this is the reason why then a lot of priestly Torah were added from Genesis to Deuteronomy into that collection. And after these scribes believed that there is no other king, God did not send a new David. He is the only king. And they believe that Jerusalem is the secret center of the divine kingship over the whole world. I call these scribes theocratic, meaning the kingdom of the reign of God is in the center of their thinking. And now I come to the question of Sabbath. Zach, you have from my notes made a helpful picture, and perhaps the auditory can follow that, so that it will help them to understand what happened. Thank you for doing that. That's awesome. That's great. I cannot do that. I love you, new technical generation. I am a very old-fashioned 20th century guy, and I really pray and hope for the 21st century generation to develop teaching in a more professional and interesting way than just giving lectures as I do. Now, let me now, for the auditory, try to describe what happened. It said that it was observed that the collection in Exodus 20:19 to 33, that is called Covenant Code, must be older because Deuteronomy quotes it and changes it. So when we look at that part, we see the oldest form of the commandment. And I read now from the Jewish Study Bible, the English translation. You find it in Exodus 23, verse 12. 6 days you shall do your work, but on the 7th day you shall cease from labor, in order that your ox and your ass may rest, and that your bondman and the stranger be refreshed. Now, this is, when I read the Hebrew text, it is that your ox may rest and your ass, and that the son of your female slave shall rest and be refreshed. So the children of the female slave must have a rest. That is the lowest servant in the household. And the migrant, the foreigners who have got a shelter in your household. And they don't belong to the family. They just serve, they are servants, but they don't have a home except in this family. So the verb that is used here is the verb at the seventh day you shall end your work. You shall stop working. And the verb in Hebrew is shavat. Shavat. Shin, Veit, Tav. Shavat. So stop, not in the meaning of rest or sleep, but just leave all your work. And it is clear why on the seventh day. There you see a principle in the religious tradition that you can also observe in the verses before that, where it says, 6 years you shall sow your land and gather in its yield, but in the seventh you shall let it rest and life follow. Let the needy among your people eat of it, and what they leave let the wild beasts eat. You shall do the same with your vineyards and your olive groves. So the Lord puts a commandment that people leave the land, follow, and leave it to God again. And the idea is that there is not those who own the land will have the usufruct, but those who are needy, including the animals. So we call these sorts of special protection after this 6-7 scheme the law of the privilege of the Lord. The law of the privilege of the Lord. The Lord has the privilege on the land. And the Lord has the privilege on the seventh day. And why does he have the privilege? That it is not used by those who are rich and strong, but that it can be used by those who are needy, and which in the Latin word we call personae miserae, people in miserable situations, and to protect the animals. This is the oldest formulation of the seventh day rest we have. And then we don't have anything about it until the Deuteronomistic decalogue in Deuteronomy 5. Here we have a change in the formulation. And when you go to Deuteronomy 5, you see the decalogue as reported by Moses to the people. I go to the Jewish Study Bible translation. Observe the Sabbath day and keep it holy as the Lord your God has commanded you. And this is new. Yeah. Interesting enough, the word Sabbath day did not appear in the sources of the prophets or in the older layers of the Pentateuch before. And the Hebrew word standing here is Yom HaShabbat. And it sounds as if it was the same as the verb shavat that we read in Exodus 23:12. But you hear that the B is doubled and strongly outspoken. Shabbat. And this word is not derived from the word Shabbat, stop working, rest, but from a noun, Shabbatu, that was used in the Babylonian culture to describe this day, the holy day of full moon, because the Babylonians rested from work on new moon day and on full moon day. And this we can also observe in pre-exilic Israel texts. But the interesting thing is now that the word Shabbat by the Jewish decalogue is used to say this is the Yom HaShabbat, and then it repeats the formulation of the covenant code. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but the 7th day, and now it says not you shall leave your work, but the 7th day is a Sabbath, and it belongs to the Lord, here's the holy name, your God. And then it repeats the formulation, the old formulation, you shall not do any work. But now we see the series of people who stop is enlarged. You shall not do work. Your son or your daughter, your male, your female slave, your ox, your ass, or any of your cattle, or the stranger in your settlements, so that your male and female slave may rest as you do. So it is interesting that now, when the whole people has become enslaved again, the old 7 days rest rule for slaves and cattle is in the Decalogue enlarged, and that it is referred to the whole household and to the whole family and to the whole people and to all the animals that belong to the Israelite community. And the reason is, remember that you were a slave in the land of Egypt, and that the Lord of your God freed you from there with a mighty hand and outstretched arm. Therefore the Lord your God has commanded you to observe the Sabbath day. Now the Sabbath has a new fundament. We shall keep this rule because we must remember that we wouldn't be slaves still if God would not have freed us. Now, think that this text now was added to the law of Deuteronomy in the exilic period. So it is very clear that the slavery in Egypt served as a paradigm for the slaves in Babylonia, and understanding themselves as people who still hope to be released by the strength of God. Interesting enough, this rule was fixed and canonized in the book of Deuteronomy, and the Decalogue was repeated in Exodus 20. But now you can go back to your picture, to your, yeah. We have a gap. We have a gap now in the question of observance of the Sabbath. And here your picture should include what happened after the exile. So at the third column, there should be Nehemiah. After the exile, of course, the congregation took their position, and we observe that the Persians had a Persian governor in Judah, so there was no Jewish governor. And the only place where the Jews could decide on their own fate was in the temple community, because there the scribes put down the scrolls, and there people could ask when they had difficulties in lawsuits for what to do, and the priests could look up in the Torah, especially the so-called Levitical priests, what to do. Now, when we read the report on Nehemiah, we see that people did not follow the law as they should. And the book of Nehemiah reports on many measures that Nehemiah tried to implement so that there more would follow the new Deuteronomistic law. And there is a report about a covenant in Nehemiah 10, where all the priests and the responsible people gather, and they make a self-obligation that they will gather enough wood and they will bring enough cattle and flock so that the cult at the house of God can be performed in a good way. And in this self-obligation, we read also the peoples of the land who bring their wares and all sorts of foodstuff for sale on the Sabbath day, we will not buy from them on the Sabbath on a holy day. Now we can date Nehemiah in the year 445 before Christ. The exile was ended with the conquest of Babylon, 539. So from that point, people could go back to Jerusalem. But interesting enough, there is a happy selling and affairs and in the holy city, close to the temple, that salesmen come into the town and sell their stuff, not only the cattle for the sacrifices, but everything you need. Which means that the idea to rest on Sabbath was not so good observed at that time. And what Nehemiah did is to make sure that at least inside the new wall of Jerusalem, which he had built, that in the holy precinct, there should be a maintenance of the Sabbath. We can also see a letter from Israelites or Jews who lived in Egypt. There was a community of soldiers at the island of Elephantine, Egyptian called Jeb, in the south of Egypt. This community had the task to control the trade from Africa into Egypt, and the exports, and to protect the divine tombs that lay on the other side of the river in Luxor. Interesting enough, there was an Egyptian unit who had a temple, and at the same ground, the Jewish community had a temple too. But it was for three gods. It was for the God of Israel, the Lord, the God of Bethel, and the goddess Anat. This was in the 5th century, at the same time at Nehemiah. And there is a letter, they have found a lot of papyri in Elephantine, and contracts and interesting things. One letter is of a salesman who commands his slave to fetch the new delivery of vegetables that are brought by boat to the island on Sabbath. So he interdicts his servant to rest on Sabbath, because when the vegetables come, you must fetch them. You cannot take any idea about Sabbath rest whatsoever. You have to fetch them. And we have that letter. And that is from post-Nehemiah. That means that the observance of the Sabbath was much more liberal in the community, in the everyday community, than it should have been according to the Torah. Now, what we have then is that we find that when the Pentateuch was completed by the Holiness Code, by the priestly scribes, 50 years after Nehemiah, at the time of Ezra, then we can read in the Holiness Code in Leviticus 23 about the obligations for the holidays. And in Leviticus 23, we read about the Sabbath. These are my fixed times, the fixed times of the Lord, which you shall proclaim as sacred occasions and meetings. On 6 days work may be done, but on the 7th day there shall be a Sabbath of complete rest, a sacred occasion. You shall do no work. It shall be a Sabbath of the Lord throughout your settlements. Which means not only in Jerusalem. In all settlements where Jews live, they have to obey to the commandment of Sabbath. So from that time onwards, it was clear that the Sabbath had a new dignity. And we can observe in the narratives of the 4th century that it was observed more severely. And this is the reason why not only I, but also other colleagues, as for example, my colleague Thomas Krüger already 15, 20 years ago, and others, assume that the priestly narrative about the creation in Genesis 1 originally was ended with a sentence in verse 31, Genesis 1:31, that says, And God saw all that he made and found it very good. So this was the ending. And then it starts, the priestly narrative goes over to the flood, to the generations between the first man and the flood, and then the flood. And it's filled up with this story about Adam and Eve and the paradise. So in the Hexateuch composition, this story was connected directly to that point, and it was clear that the Sabbath was rooted in the decalogue and in the Holiness Code. But as I said before, these priests were convinced that the God of Israel, who reigned from his holy temple, should be considered as the king of the world. And they had the idea that the timing of the creation, the work of the creation, was part of a 6 days work of God. And they implemented the Sabbath in the creation as a universal world order for all peoples in the world. Because it said, on the seventh day, God finished, completed, perfected the world that he had been doing, and he ceased on the seventh day from all the work that he had done. God himself rests because his creation is perfect. And God blessed the seventh day and declared it holy. Here you have this holiness theology that is leading for the holiness code, that the people of Israel shall be holy, Leviticus 19:2, because their God is holy. And this holiness starts with the seventh day, because on it God ceased from all the work of creation that he had done. So the Israelite rule is considered as a universal rule, which means if all peoples in the world would follow it, they would follow the commandment to preserve and watch the creation, that they would be as the images of God who preserve the creation that God has created. And that helps on every day, on every seventh day, the creation to rest from exploration. So these priests saw that their idea of holiness has an impact on the general universal ethics of the world community. And now the scribes who have put in this measure, they say that God has taught the Israelites to follow his rule in the desert. And they give a narrative in Exodus 16 about that. And when Moses starts to build the tabernacle, they believe that God has reminded Moses of the Sabbath. And we now go to Exodus 31:12 forth following. It says, "And the Lord said to Moses, speak to the Israelite people and say, nevertheless, you must keep my Sabbath. For this is a sign between me and you throughout ages, that you may know that I, the Lord, have consecrated, sanctified you. You shall keep the Sabbath, for it is holy for you. He who profanes it shall be put to death. Here you see that the observation of Sabbath becomes a holy perspective, and to touch the holy, to profane the holy, means that you lose your life, because you can only live when you live in harmony with the holy. When you assault the holy, you will be put to death. That's the idea. You cannot live together with the holy and behave unholy. And as we see, the guy in Elephantine had no idea about that holiness. And even Nehemiah was not so radical, because what did the merchants do? Okay, they could not enter the holy city, but of course they stood outside. So if you needed something on Sabbath, you could leave the city and say, well, borrow me something, I give you the money tomorrow. And that's how Jews in the Jewish quarter in Jerusalem do until today. When they see on Sabbath that they need something that they are not allowed to buy, they go to their Arabian neighbors and ask them to borrow something that they need and pay it on the next day, because they are not allowed to pay on the holy day in Jerusalem. So you see, this holiness school, or these theocratic theology, has formed a new attitude with respect to Sabbath. And well, for traditional historical exegetes, now the difference of my theory with Genesis 1 to 2, 3 is that I consider the 7-day scheme and the Sabbath as a scribal reworking of the priestly story in Genesis 1 at the priestly redaction of the Pentateuch. Redaction means scribes took the scroll, rewrote it, and gave it a new meaning by their holiness theology, and inserting certain commandments or narratives to strengthen this theory and this insight. And when you now read it in a synchronic way, you read even the old Sabbath commandments in the hermeneutical light of the priestly reworking. That was a short answer to your question. Sorry.
Yeah, no, I really appreciate it. So now that we're at the end of the video, we can start the topic now. So we are actually about an hour long here. Now, I've got lots of time. Do you have some time for more questions?
Yes.
Okay, all right, perfect.
Welcome.
All right, so you said a lot there, of course. So I just want to put this in perspective for my audience. So when you talk about all these different sources, and you have Exodus 23 and Deuteronomy 5, and then maybe changing later what we see in Genesis 2 with the creation account, this isn't just like you randomly picking some verses and then saying, hey, this seems like something's changing. What you're doing is you're taking previous scholarship we already know about a covenant code, where even very conservative scholars would say, hey, this seems to be one of the latest, one of the or should I say one of the earliest texts that we have in the Torah. Then you also see the Deuteronomistic code, where almost every scholar out there will say, hey, this was probably written later than a lot of this other stuff here, in the book of Deuteronomy. And then you also have a priestly layer, which, as I said, just like these other texts, you also have a priestly layer, which seems to be a very much later text than the rest of this. So it's not. So there is some debate about whether the Holiness Code is specifically before the other priestly layer, or how far after that, and the exact timing. But generally, what you're doing is you're taking research we already know with the sections that we already have, and you're noticing that there is a changing in these ideas of Sabbath, or it looks like it. It doesn't make sense for Exodus 23 to mention just a normal, hey, do the Sabbath because it's good for your animals and your people, and then Deuteronomy 5, which with all the other data we have, seems to say that the Sabbath is to remember slavery. It doesn't say anything about remember Genesis. The same thing with the Exodus 23 text. It doesn't say anything about, hey, remember Genesis because that's what God did when he was creating. No, it just says, hey, it would be good for your animals. And then later on, it seems that it just happens to match up. And that seems very unlikely for all this to be happening if there wasn't some change going on. Is that a good summary of what you're saying?
Yes, I think you caught the central points. What I am doing is in a tradition of research that started in the 18th century. So scholars have analyzed these texts on and on and on, and there are, of course, American scholars who analyzed Genesis 1 to 11 as Ronald Hendel, who has another perspective on the priestly layers than I have. But what we can say for those who try to find a reconstruction of the layers is that there is a general consent of these phases, a pre-exilic phase, the Deuteronomic phase, the exilic Deuteronomistic phase, and the priestly basic narrative in late exile, and then the post-exilic combination of the Hexateuch and a priestly redaction, let me call it holiness redaction, in the post-exilic period, in the late post-exilic period. When you ask scholars, you will find very, very different positions with respect to single texts, but there seems to be, at least in Western and exegesis, and consensus in that direction. And for those who believe this is God's word, that's no problem, because how God reveals his word and his message in steps, generations by generations, it's a process of self-revelation of God included in that. So of course we can read these scriptures as expression of a religious revelation and a theological expression, even if we see that there was a historical development in its formation.
Yeah. Well, thank you for explaining that further there. So, so there's a lot of stuff that we could talk about here, where people maybe not as familiar with it, might be a little confused. But what's the covenant code, or the Deuteronomistic layer that we have, or the priestly code? And there's tons of books and videos online about evidence for that. So I don't want to get bogged down into that too much. What I just stress really quick is that this is not just some liberal view trying to destroy the Bible or something like that. That there's lots of
No,
conservative scholars that
no,
hold. Yeah,
no.
maybe. Uh-huh.
It's the opposite. It's to take the text for serious as a historical document and a witness about the revelation. Yeah. So it's not. We are far from the idea that we want to assault or falsify the biblical text. No, it is a modern historical way to understand the formation of the text and include historical critical thinking with theological thinking. Yeah, and this is in the States. There are many churches that refuse to do so because they identify history and revelation. But as you would never identify science and revelation, you cannot identify history and revelation. But you can say that the witness about revelation was given in history, which means that revelation went into history. And that's what the Bible says. So, but there will be talks between evangelical biblicist exegetes that totally refuse this, what I call historical critical approach. And they say, oh, you don't believe in the truth of the word of God. And I say, you believe that the truth of the word of God is in the jail of historical categories, and it is not. God can use every way of revealing himself, even telling you a myth, a mythical story, as the Revelation story is. It is the pre-science scholarship of antiquity to describe the generation and of the cosmos as a creational process. So, of course, this debate is not led between these two branches. Fundamentalist evangelicals, they condemn historical criticism as a result of the work of people who don't believe, and then they end the dialogue. But my experience is I can have a dialogue with conservative, fundamentalist Jewish rabbis and Talmud pupils, as well as with biblicists, when we go onto the synchronic understanding, because in every text there are different perspectives. And if they want to follow the modern way of thinking according to the Enlightenment, then I invite them to apply historical approaches. Because there are people who believe that evidence and science and enlightenment you cannot just ignore. And you cannot even ignore when looking at the biblical texts. So it is evident that Genesis 1 is not a scientific text. Yeah, it is very evident. But it is a very serious text when you consider it in its time as expression of the knowledge and the religious insight of people in antiquity. Then it is a great text because it sees more than Greek philosophers at the same time have seen. And I think that is the approach we need for those who don't follow anti-enlightenment fundamentalism in religion.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I was hoping that you would be able to just, very clearly and succinctly describe what you would say are the evolution of the idea of Sabbath theology. So starting with Exodus 23, that I'll put on the screen here. So it says, "For 6 days you are to do your work, but on the seventh day you must cease, in order that your ox and your donkey may rest, and that your female servants, sons, and the resident form may refresh themselves." So, so it doesn't say anything about your family and but could you make that clear? Like, what is not in this text that we see later?
The oldest original text is what I called a law of privilege of God with respect to this seventh day.
Mm.
And it's called the seventh day. It's not called the day of Sabbath.
Mm.
And the meaning is to protect the weakest in the line of production and work from exploration. Yeah. So it's an old protection law to prevent exploration.
Mm-hmm.
And the difference with the Decalogue and Deuteronomy is that Deuteronomy 5 was written down by people in exile, where the whole people was now in slavery again. And at a sudden, they considered, okay, the Babylonians, they have a Shabbat day, and we have the seventh day, and we call it the Sabbath day. And we celebrate it on every seventh day. They had, in Al-Yahudu and other places, they had Jewish settlements where they were expected to work at the land and to give a part of the product to the government. And they could say, okay, and on the seventh day, we are now slaves, we rest. And we all are slaves. And this is what God meant. It concerns all the people that is in slavery, that they should rest. So here you see that the historical situation has an impact on the reformulation of the seventh day rule. And they take up the word Shabbatu and transform it into the Jewish Hebrew thinking and say, that's the Sabbath day. Yeah. And from that time onwards, the question was, how far do we have to rest? Yeah. And as you can see then in these holiness theologies, after a certain period, they strengthened the idea that it was not only a privileged day to protect the weak, but that it was a holy day consecrated by God, and that is holy because and the holy people must observe it. So this holiness theology says also this is the respect, that is the consequence, that you respect the holy day as the day holy for God. So they developed the theory of holiness of the Sabbath day. And that is the result that we have in the Sabbath theology of the Jewish tradition.
Okay, thank you. And so then there's also the question of what was specifically added in Genesis 1 and 2, so the first creation account. So are you saying that you think that the text of Genesis 1 with the first 6 days and the rakia being created and then everything is made and all this other stuff, and then the humans, that was previous, but then this seventh day concept was added later, or how would you describe that?
Now, you in the note for this podcast, you give a hint to my essay on the Sabbath in Academia Edu. Now, when you read this text, you can see that there are passages where it is said, for example, God made a vault, made a firmament, above the above the earth, to keep back the flood from the earth. So so there you can reconstruct sentence by sentence where the narrative says God made the creation, and it's really using the word to do, to make, asa. But so, for example, in Genesis 1, verse 7, and God made the vault and separated the water under the vault from the water above it. And God called the vault sky. And God made 2 great lights and the stars, and God set them in the vault of the sky to give light on the earth, to govern the day and the night. If you collect all these passages that report that God does something and makes something, then you get an old narrative. And this observation was also already made in the 18th century. And it was called the work narrative. And there is a trace that God says, let us make humankind in our image, in verse 26. To whom does he say it? This is not a majestic plural because it did not exist in ancient Hebrew. So there is a trace that in this old narrative, there were some heavenly beings around him. And that the original idea was, he created mankind according to the divine heavenly images. But then I said that the priest who took this old narrative, reworked it, and he reworked it with a word theology. Because he brought into it, then God said, let there be light, and there was light. And God saw that the light was good. Here, the light is created independently from sun and moon. And it is created only by the word of God. It is not, there's no report, and then he made the light. So this priestly reworking of the old myth or source wants to stress that God only by his word can create the world. His word produces reality and meaning. So he puts the creational work under the understanding of God made his word become real. And so the sentence, and it was so, that fits to the word line. For example, and God said, let there be a vault between the waters to separate water from water. And it was so, it happened so, means his word was fulfilled. We can see that in some rather old manuscripts, this sentence, and it was so, is put at the end of the working passage. So it says, and God said, let there be a vault between the waters to separate from the water from water. And God made the vault and separated the water under the vault, and so on, and called the word sight. And it was so. So there are manuscripts where we have this other sequence of sentences, which is, to my mind, a clear signal that the word theology was brought in to this work theology. And what was the background? Well, God revealed his word to Moses and his name to Moses, that he would free Israel, Exodus 6, 2-8. This is the priestly word theology. And this word was already so strong that it could create the whole universe. And that means that the cosmos has an intrinsic meaning, because the light is good, which means that darkness that makes life impossible is not considered to be good. So whoever follows the order of creation follows the light that makes life possible and not the darkness that makes life impossible. This view of this story that now presents everything also says that it was God, and that means when he created man, may he be female, may he be male, mankind could only be the image of one God. So he was forced to consider men and women equal as part of mankind. Yeah. So all forms, the text does not say he created him as man and woman, but he created him male and female. So because now this priest was convinced of that, what I told you about Deutero-Isaiah group, that the God was only one. He was a monotheist. He is convicted of monotheism. And this conviction had been strengthened and brought up by the end of the exile in the Persian period. So when the Persians believed that their God, the God of wisdom, gave them all the world, and their task was to fight against the darkness and to bring up a world of light, that was the ideology of the Persians, the priestly answer was, our God is the one God, and he reigns light and darkness. But what we have to gather is we see that the light is good. So that was the reason why Jewish soldiers could serve in the Persian army. Yeah. So you see, when you interpret the text as a development of ideas at the end of the exilic period, it makes a new sense. Yeah? And it makes a sense within history, and it does not touch the question, is God true or not? God is more than true. And now, when you look at the text from the idea of this 7-day scheme, you say that the creation does not really fit into these 7 days. They have, at some days, God has to do more things. He has not enough time. He has not enough days, so he must create. The plants and the creatures of the sea at the same time. So plants and fishes are created on one day. And there you can see when the scribes wanted to bring in the idea of Sabbath as a creational order into that story, they had to make compromises with the tradition they had before them. And this indicates, to my observance, that the 7-day scheme has been brought in by the Holiness school scribes to bring in the Sabbath into the creational cosmic idea. And that was a great idea, as I told you, because that made the rest to become a universal ecological idea. So I would not say, oh, that is so foolish, 7 days, that won't work. So that was not their way of thinking. They did not go into the school of enlightenment. And they didn't think either, oh, 1 day is whatsoever million years, or 1,000 years, or whatsoever. They did not make up these arguments that you find in certain branches of what we call creationist theology. I mean, they were developing thought on the level of a symbolic narrative and a metaphoric narrative, not a philosophy without God, but a religious theory within God. And this narrative we call a mythical narrative. And there is a philosopher in my town, Blumenberg, who says this is the way how intellectuals work with myths. It's Arbeit am Mythos, working with the myth. And this is actually what priests and reverends do when they explain this text to modern people. They are working with this metaphorical, mythical narrative to make clear, imagine what would happen if we would celebrate the rest of creation every 7th day. Yeah. So, and this can be a very modern, liberal, Democrat, Republican, whatsoever guy. The point is that he comes from this religious inspiration of the text. Yeah. And of course, he wouldn't go to the NASA and say, the world is only 5,700 years old, so why do you want to visit the moon? It cannot be older. Yeah. So they never would bring in the metaphorical thinking of the biblical arguments into a modern empirical science. This would be a mixed up of categories. And you cannot bring God into a scientific analysis and show, oh, here in this glass of water, I have him. Yeah, I have a scientific proof. People who do that are not seriously believing in the greatness of God.
Yeah. So just for clarity there, just for my audience's sake and my own. So do you think that that we originally had a creation text very similar to this, but then the days were added later, including the last part about God finishing the work on the seventh day and he made it holy? Do you think that those were added later?
Yeah.
Okay. All right.
Yeah.
And do you assign a specific time period for generally when that would have been added?
Yes. The two arguments I told you. The first argument is that now we observe that the holiness theology, the holiness code, is a later insertion into the composition of the Pentateuch. Yeah. You can and it's connected about. It's not the 5th century as you wrote. It's, to my mind, around 400.
Okay.
Yeah, but anyway, or late 5th century, whatsoever. And Pentateuch redaction around 400. That means that there was I lost my trade. When they brought this holiness perspective into that collection, this had consequences not only for Leviticus, but it was applied in other parts of the Pentateuch. Yes, and you can trace the same what Knoll called holiness school, what I call Pentateuch redaction, in other places of the Pentateuch, and I would assume that this 7-day scheme was brought in. And you can imagine it like that. You have a text, you see, oh, here it is. I write a new scroll, and I rewrite the old text, and I frame it by my editings. So the scroll becomes a little longer. Yeah? So that's the way how they worked it. There is an own research branch in scroll production and how you can imagine how they worked. We have, of course, these findings from Qumran, where you can see how scribes in the 2nd century before Christ produced scrolls. And you find, for example, a Torah scroll. It's called the Temple Scroll. And there they copied text from Leviticus and Deuteronomy and combined them with texts you never find anywhere, but that give rules for the Second Temple worship. And they say, this is the Torah of Moses. So they wrote an additional Torah of Moses for the Second Temple orders in order to complete or have an addition to the Pentateuch scrolls. And this is the Temple Scroll. You can go to a library, you can read it. So the production of scribes is a known thing. And I have, of course, thought about how it could have worked to have a hexateuch composition how long shall it be, and what happens when you put other types in it and you cut off a part. So, but I won't bother you with these details. This is a specialist part of the work.
Yeah. So I can see that some people might find this really interesting, but then maybe have a difficult time understanding why your ideas are more probable, more likely than something else. So, for example, somebody could say that Genesis 1, the creation account, that it was just created out of maybe some oral tradition, or that it was just added later. So there was no like, there wasn't just a creation count and then somebody came in and added the 6th and the 7th day and all that, and the make it holy. That whole thing, they would say, hey, that wasn't added later. That's just what it was originally created as. So what makes you say that it was something that was added later compared to just or something back up there? What makes you say that parts of the Genesis 1 text and Genesis 2 to 3 were added later, instead of all of it coming together at the one time and they just putting it on the front of what they called the Torah, or whatever that was?
Well, the theory you present was the traditional view to see these things. People understood the whole composition as a unit, and taking up diverse traditions. So, and then many scholars start, okay, they had the oldest tradition and then they put the newer upon it. So the debate is, they had the pre-exilic tradition and the priestly was put upon it later. I have a different view about that. In that case, that I say there was a priestly scroll, but those who combined it with the older sources were not the same as the writers of the priestly tradition. Yeah, and the priestly tradition was written, and the older sources were written, and there was another person who combined it. Because if it had been the priest who integrated the story on Adam and Eve, why didn't he change the Adam and Eve story so that it was more fitting into his story? Yeah. So that we still can see that it are different stories, it makes clear that they had another way of thinking. Yeah. They did not say, if you follow one logic, it must follow the same logic in the second text. But they had a thinking that I call combinatory thinking, or complementary thinking. Complementary thinking. That means, okay, this is a truth, and this is a truth. And this truth explains things that is not explained here in the other truth. And if we read it together, they can shed light on each other. So there are all these things happened. There are texts in the Bible that are a composition from diverse traditions. And there are texts from different background that were combined by a scribal, what we call redactor. That's not a redactor as in the press, but a person who combines different scrolls into a new composition. Yeah. Many in German we have two words for that. In in the Washington Post, the guy is called redacteur. But the scribe who combines sources is called redaktor. In English, there is not a difference between these both ways. That makes a difficulty. There are many from the Anglo-Saxon world who say, I don't do redaction criticism. Yeah, because they don't have a clear idea what is redaction. Yeah, and I have a redaction critical approach, but it's not the absolute only one. Yeah, so from text to text, you have to decide what happened. That's our everyday work. That's why we use day by day for analysis of these texts and correlate them with extra biblical texts to understand what happened and what could be the historical background for this specific formation of compositions.
So you think that the Genesis 1 to 2-3, that this general structure existed, but then later you have Genesis 2:2-3
Yes.
with this additional theology added later. And the reason you think that is because when you look at the rest of the Torah and other texts like Nehemiah or archaeology elephantine, that we see that there's an evolution of thought, so that there's good reason to think that maybe Genesis 1, the main part of the text there, existed previously, but then we see that there was some evolution, so that part that evolved must have been added later, even though the text was originally there. Is that a good way to put it?
Yes. There is one. I believe that the basic layer of P, the priestly code, without this Sabbath theology, was combined with the story on Adam and Eve and the paradise. And after that, when the Holiness code was brought into the Pentateuch, the Holiness theology was brought into Genesis 2. So, one reason is, why don't Adam and Eve observe the Sabbath? Yeah, Noah does not know the Sabbath. Yeah, he knows the calendar. But he does not observe the Sabbath. Abraham does not observe the Sabbath. The observance of the Sabbath is taught in the desert. And before that, there is no report that anybody observed the Sabbath. And this is, for me, is also signal that the Sabbath commandment, although it existed, but it existed in the covenant code, yeah, and in the decalogue. So that there it existed, but it was not brought into the creation story. Yeah, so it existed, it was observed or not observed, and to make give a new fundament for the observance from the Holiness school, they reworked by rewriting Genesis 1 and 2:3 by inserting the Sabbath theology into that chapter. And then they brought it into the Decalogue in Exodus 20. And in Deuteronomy, it was not continued. Why? Because, Deuteronomy is for the people who live somewhere. But the Holiness Code is for the people who lives close to the sanctuary, and they demand we keep it. And in the other places, you should keep it too. Yes, but what of course you cannot do is to bring a certain offering for the bath to the sanctuary when you live in Aleppo. Yeah? So there were Jews at the Persian time who lived in close to the Euphrates, in the whole area of the Trans-Euphratine, from the Euphrates to the Red Sea. So it was not possible to literally follow the Torah for all people who were Jewish at that time.
So what is that? What do you mean that it was not possible for them to follow? So certain sacrifices at the temple couldn't have been followed, of course.
Yeah.
But is that what you mean, or
yes?
Like,
but to be observant, not to work. Yeah. Not to make fire, not to make gather, not to make merchandise, and so on. That was possible everywhere, and that's what Jews always did. So they took the holiness that has been laid upon them with them into the places where they lived. So when they gather at Sabbath Eve, they celebrate the presence of the holiness in the whole world. Yeah, they celebrate it in Seattle and in Jakarta, wherever Jews are. They celebrate the holiness of that day. And that is, of course, according to Genesis 1. So this holiness idea brings universality and makes it possible, but makes a difference also between the reality of those who live in the Holy Land and those who don't yet live close to the temple. Yeah.
And specifically, so these people in Babylon or Elephantine, what could they have not done that was commanded at a specific point in the Torah? So what specifically could they not do because they were outside of the land?
To bring an offering at the Sabbath day to the sanctuary.
Okay.
But everything else they could do. They could eat clean food. They let their cattle rest. They did not work. They did not, after a while, they did not light fires, and so on. So all the rules that the rabbis then have noted in the Mishnah, the teaching on how to keep the Torah after there is no temple, you find observed until today. So, that's of course the insight of monotheism and holiness that made this possible. That a Jewish identity could be lived everywhere.
Yeah. Well, thank you for explaining all that. And so I just wanted to, just kind of as a last question there, I just wanted to make it explicit because this is a very popularly cited passage. So Exodus 20:11, if I can find it here. I'll just do it like this. Exodus 20:11. So this text is very, very popular passage. It says 28 to 20:11 says, remember the Sabbath day by keeping it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but the seventh day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. On it you shall do no work, neither you nor your son nor your daughter, family servant, all these other people. For in 6 days the Lord made the heavens and the earth, the sea, and all that is in them. But he rested on the seventh day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath and made it holy. So this text, that you would argue this was formed or written much later than something like the
I said that we have two versions of the decalogue. We have a version in Deuteronomy 5, and we have a version in Exodus 20.
Okay.
And in Deuteronomy 5 and in Exodus 20, there is a common fundament for the Sabbath, that is the seventh day is a Sabbath to the Lord, and you shall not do your work. And then all the people are called are named who shall not work. That is the same in Deuteronomy and in Exodus 20.
Okay.
So after Genesis 2 was 2 to 3 was added to the creation story, of course, this must also be put into the version of the Decalogue you find in Exodus 20. So it was inserted in Exodus 20, verse 11, but it was not inserted in Deuteronomy 5. Yeah. So why that? Because they knew that there was an old version that Moses had related, and they left the relation or the tradition of Moses in Deuteronomy. But with respect to the divine teaching of the Holiness Code, they and of creation, where Moses was not present and couldn't put down the commandments. Yeah. On this version of the tablet, it was noted. So so we can here we have a trace that verse 11 in Exodus 20 is a later in we call it Fortschreibung. You write, and then you write in addition an additional note that reminds of Genesis 2. So that's what happened when the Holiness School inserted the Sabbath theology in creation. It put it into verse 11, and then they said also, remember. Yes, because remember, that means you should have remembered since creation. Yeah. So in Deuteronomy it said observe, but here it said remember. So by this way, and it was no problem, because according to the narrative, the first version of the Decalogue was the immediate first word of God. When you read, for example, Leviticus 19, you see that here a speech of God to Moses is noted in order to pass this divine speech on to the people and to the priests, that they may pass it on to further generations. So there is a difference between the covenant code that Moses received from God, put it down, and read it out to the people, Exodus 24, and the Deuteronomy that was believed to be by God given in addition and presented at the entrance of the land and put down there by Moses, and the Holiness Code, where the speeches of God are given as immediate divine teachings to Moses in the tent of meeting. So as Genesis 2 relates a divine teaching, also in Exodus 20:11 is related a divine teaching, as in the Holiness Code that still was when they were close to the tabernacle. Yeah? So there is an inner logic of the scribes where they put their texts into the former scroll and narrative.
Mm. Yeah. Well, thank you so much for explaining that. That's very helpful there. So, was there anything else that you wanted my audience to know about that you think is important for your view that we haven't talked about?
I have talked so much, you must be tired. You cannot say everything. That's why God's word is greater than human words. And you can just stop it and say, now I stop to speak and I shut up and leave the spirit and the room to the divine word itself. So just read the Bible and meet God.
Amen. All right. Well, thank you so much for coming on here. And additionally, was there any books that you've written or any articles that you would recommend that people check out related to this topic or anything else you've written about?
The main works I have written are written in German. So if you dare to read several hundred pages in German, you're invited to read my book on Numbers, Die Vollendung der Torah, 2003, and my book on Exodus, Die Komposition der Torah, im Buch Exodus. And otherwise, I have a collection of English essays in 2024 that is called From Pentateuch to Prophetic Torah. So you might find it somewhere in the internet. It will, yeah. So and I have written several articles in the Oxford Handbook of Biblical Law and Oxford Handbook on the Pentateuch that are in English and that may help to understand my perspective. Although in the handbooks, I try not to be idiosyncratic, but leave the minds open to other positions and views.
Yeah,
of course. Yeah. So you can read Achenbach if you like.
So this was the audience question. Just real quick, it's okay if you don't have any thoughts on this, but do you think that it's true that there are traditions in modern Indonesia that resemble traditions from the ancient Near East?
Yes. Now, that's I was teaching in Sumatra in 92 to 94. And the main culture in the area, the Batak culture, they had collections of myths and they had collections of traditional law. And in the myths, you can observe that we have the idea that from the heavenly sphere, there is a creator, and he sends a salvation, divine salvator, who kills the big sea dragon and puts the earth upon it and forms human beings and forms creation. And this is to some extent comparable to ancient Near Eastern myths that we have in Numa Elish and others, and of which we have also traces in some of the Psalms, where it is said that God kills the big sea dragon and so on. So then in the law, we have in ancient Assyrian law the punishment for adultery, that a couple who is brought up in that situation, they were forced they were excluded from the community, and they were forced to bow down to the ground and pick up cereals with their mouth from the floor. And interestingly enough, the same rule existed in the adat of the Batak. So what I then said is I translated the ancient Near Eastern myths and the ancient Near Eastern laws that have parallels in the Bible, and encouraged the pupil, the students, to analyze whether they find similarities and differences in their own tribal culture and tradition with these ancient Near Eastern or even biblical tradition. And there were interesting results, and they tried to form a known contextual theological system from these observations. So I did not tell them what to do with the material, but they could draw their own conclusions from that material and investigate it themselves. What I gave them was the translation of the Babylonian and Assyrian texts, and I made a Hebrew-Indonesian word book so that they could read the Hebrew Bible in their own language and did not need an English word book or whatsoever. So my concept was to offer my expertise to provide material for their own research development. That was the background.
Very fascinating. Awesome. Well, thank you so much for that little summary there.
Welcome.
Yeah, thank you so much for everybody for watching, and make sure you check out Dr. Achenbach's work. Thank you so much for coming on here. But otherwise, I hope everybody else has a great rest of your day.
Yeah, have a good day.